Muy buenos días, muy buena tarde. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas
Good
al
morning, good
seminario
afternoon,
organizado por
everyone.
WRI México,
Welcome to this webinar
titulado
organized by
Integración de
WRI
los
Mexico.
contaminantes climáticos de vida
The
corta
title of
en las
today's
contribuciones
webinar is
nacionalmente
Integrating Short-lived
determinadas.
Climate
Tengo el
Pollutants
honor
into
de ser
Nationally
la
Determined
moderadora
Contributions. I
de,
have the honor of
del-
being
de los
the
paneles que tenemos en el
moderator
seminario. Yo soy
today.
Beatriz Cárdenas,
My name is
soy
Beatriz
directora global
Cárdenas.
de
I
calidad
am
del
the
aire
Global
de
Director
WRI.
for Air
Y
Quality in
bueno, tenemos
WRI.
este importante
And
seminario
this is a very
sobre
important
contaminantes de
webinar that
vida
we have
corta y
today
conglobales
around
o como NDCs ya
SLCPs
integrados en las
and how
contribuciones
they have
nacionalmente
been
determinadas.
integrated into NDCs.
Seguramente ustedes saben que los contaminantes de vida corta
Surely you'll
o
know that
short-lived
short-lived
pollutants o
climate
superpollutas
pollutants
son
or
supercontaminantes
super
son
pollutants actually
contaminantes que tienen
are
un
pollutants
potencial de
that
calentamiento global
have
y algunos de
a
ellos tienen
potential for
exorbitantes implicaciones
global
en la salud de
uh,
las personas y de los
warmth
ecosistemas.
and heat, and they
Son,
have
le
also a
llamamos
very
a estos
important effect in
superpollutantes
the
o contaminantes de
ecosystems
vida
of
corta,
people
al
and
carbono
animals.
negro, al
We
metano,
call
a los
SLCPs
antroposféricos y a
um,
los
methane,
hidrofluorocarbonos. Estos
fluorocarbonates,
contaminantes o
methane,
estos
tropospheric
contaminantes de
ozone
vida
that
corta o
contribute to nearly
superpollutant
half
contribuyen a
of
casi la
the
mitad del calentamiento
current global
global de la
warming,
atmósfera.
actually.
Como mencioné, por sus impactos en salud y en ecosistemas, en la
As
alta
mentioned
concentración de
before, due to its
permanecencia o fluctuación de
impact
patrones
on
de vida,
ecosystems and how they
han
impact
sido
on
reconocidos desde
patterns,
hace
they
muchos
have
años
been
por
recognized
la
for many,
comunidad
many years
científica, así también
by
como por
the
diferentes
scientific
gobiernos,
community
y
as
los
well
han
as
incluido
the governments around the world, and they have been included
contribuciones nacionalmente
as
determinadas.
part
Este
of
año es
their
particularmente
nationally determined
importante porque los
contributions.
países presentarán
Now, this year is
sus nuevas
particularly important because
NDCs
countries will submit
actualizadas o sexta
the
generación
next
y
generation of
sabemos que es una gran
NDCs.
oportunidad
And we know
pues
that
para
this
que
is
los
a
esfuerzos
critical
globales
opportunity
que ya se
for
han estado haciendo
global
hagan que
efforts
o
that have
impliquen que
been
más
going
países
on
incluyen en sus
to
NDCs a los
strengthen to
superpollutants y los
reduce
contaminantes de
harmful
vida
short-lived
corta.
climate
En
pollutants.
particular, en América Latina tenemos
Particularly in Latin America,
varios países
we
pioneros en
see
presentar en sus
many
NDCs
countries that have been
incluir contaminantes de
pioneers
vida corta o
in including
superpollutants, como es el caso de México,
SLCPs or
Chile
superpollutants into their NDCs, which
y
is the case of
Colombia,
Mexico,
y no
Chile, and
solamente
Colombia, for
tendremos
example.
la
And
presentación o la inclusión de
we will
contaminantes de vida corta en otros
surely have
NDCs.
other
En el seminario
NDCs,
de hoy,
including
si
the
pasamos a la siguiente,
SLCPs.
este es el programa que tenemos.
If we move on to the next slide, please.
Vamos a
Today
escuchar
we
primero
have the
de
following
Amanda
agenda.
Curry Brown, que
We will
ella es
be
la
listening
representante del
from
Clean Air
Amanda Curry
Flagship de la
Brown
coalición de clima y
first.
aire
She
limpio,
is a
quien
representative of
nos
the
va a
Clean Air
presentar,
Flagship,
nos va a dar las buenas
and
noticias de lo
she
que
will
sucedió en las
provide
dos
the good
últimas
news
semanas
of what happened
en dos
in the
conferencias
last
importantes, la
couple of weeks
de
in two very important
clima y calidad del
conferences, the
aire
one in
que se llevó
Lima
a cabo en Brasilia,
and air
así
quality
como la
in
segunda
Brasilia,
conferencia mundial sobre
and the
contaminación del aire
second
y salud que se llevó en
World
Cartagena.
Conference in
Seguramente
Cartagena,
Amanda nos
Colombia.
dará muy buenas noticias y nos pondrá al
Amanda
tanto
surely will
de los
provide
resultados de estas
an
discusiones.
update and the good
Después
news
de
around
esta
that.
presentación por Amanda,
And
tendremos
after
un panel
this
en el que
presentation by
contamos
Amanda,
con
we
nos
will have
toca
a panel
escuchar de parte de
discussion
Colombia y de
where
parte de
we will
México
listen from
cuáles son los
Colombia and
esfuerzos que han
Mexico
hecho y que están
around what
haciendo
are the efforts
para
that are being
incluir en
carried
sus
out
NDCs a
currently
los
to
contaminantes de
include
vida corta.
SLCPs in their
Escucharemos por
NDCs.
Carolina
We
Garzón.
will
Ella es
listen
consultora en datos y millones de
from
cambio climático
Carolina Garzón.
y
She
apoyo
is a
ministerial en
consultant
ambiente y
on
desarrollo
data
sostenible en
and
Colombia,
climate change
así
models
como Abraham
from
Martínez, él es
the
el
Ministry
director
of
del Laboratorio
Sustainable
Nacional de
Development in
Investigación
Colombia. As well,
sobre
we will hear from
contaminación y salud
Abraham
ambiental del MIDES.
Ortiz, General
Y después
Coordinator of the
invitamos a
reference
todas y a
labs
todos los participantes a
in
tener un
environmental health
intercambio de
and
experiencias, de
pollutants in
preguntas
Mexico.
y hacer
And
que
at
esta
the end of
sea
this
una
session,
reunión
we
en
will
donde
have an exchange
conozcamos lo que
of
están haciendo los
comments,
diferentes
questions,
países,
answers, so that we
que
can know
muchas
what each
organizaciones
countries are
están
doing,
haciendo con
what
respecto a la
many
inclusión de
organizations are actually also carrying out in
supercontaminantes
terms of
o contaminantes
adding
de vida
these
corta
super
en las
pollutants
acciones de los
or
NDCs,
SLCPs
así
into
como las
their
proyectos que se están llevando
nationally
a cabo.
determined contributions
Eh,
in their
y bueno,
current
al final
projects.
regresaré, tenemos el
And
intercambio de
then
preguntas
I'll
y sesión
be
y
back
respuestas,
with
la
closing
moderará
remarks.
Saúl Pereira, que es
The
director de
Q&A session
coordinación
will
del
be
laboratorio de
moderated by
WRI
Saul
México.
Pereira,
Y
who
bueno, al
is
final
the
tenemos
manager for
unas
climate action
conclusiones
in WRI Mexico,
que yo me
and
encargaré
I will come back, as I said, with closing remarks and a summary. Once again, just as a reminder, we have simultaneous interpretation available for this webinar. We are very happy to have so many attendees today. So welcome all, and let's get started with our webinar. As mentioned before, we will have first the participation of Amanda Curry-Brown. She will share the good news and all of the highlights on the last couple of conferences that happened in Brasilia first and then in Cartagena. Now the floor is yours, Amanda. Thank you very much for being here.
Muchas gracias, Beatrice, and I'm pleased to be joining you this morning. I joined CCAC, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, in February, and previously worked at the US EPA in the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, first as an economist and then on our international air quality and climate programs, and especially the agency's work related to superpollutants. As Beatrice spoke about, reducing superpollutants is the fastest way to slow global warming and to stay below the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set in the Paris Agreement. In addition, reducing superpollutants helps to protect human health by improving the quality of the air we breathe, food security by improving crop yields, and protects sensitive environments by limiting the amount of black carbon deposited on snow and ice-covered regions. I left the EPA in 2019, and it's been very interesting to return to see how the conversation about superpollutants has progressed in the past 5-6 years. There's definitely been an increased awareness in the climate agenda, and we're seeing progress in NDC submissions. The Stockholm Environment Institute did an analysis which showed that before 2020, 16 countries acknowledged the importance of superpollutants in their NDC compared to 47 after 2020. Similarly, 36 countries submitted NDCs that included plans for integrated climate and air quality policy before 2020 compared to 65 after. The awareness in the public health agenda does still lag behind, but it has improved substantially over that time, and there is an opportunity for continued progress. I think one really positive sign of progress is that there were very similar messages that were delivered across both the CCAC annual meeting in Brasilia and the WHO Conference on Air Pollution Health in Cartagena. At both events, we heard many voices calling for an integrated approach on air quality and climate, especially mitigation of superpollutants, in order to maximize benefits and achieve the greatest economic returns. Today, I'll highlight what I think are 6 of the most critical messages from both those events. Over both weeks, we heard how important it is to integrate science and policy and to make evidence-based policy decisions. Over the years, we've seen how important the work of CCAC's Science Advisory Panel is in doing really robust science, but also in putting technical information into language that policymakers can understand. We're also seeing the same within countries. At a superpollutant event at the WHO conference, Adalberto Maluf from Brazil highlighted the importance of listening to the science and technical people who work behind the scenes. And we heard similar messages from representatives of so many countries. Consistent with the message about science driving policy, we heard a lot about how data and monitoring is very important and needs continued improvement around the world. But at the same time, we shouldn't be paralyzed by a lack of data, because there's a lot we already know about superpollutants, and proven solutions exist that can be implemented now. Over 2 weeks, we heard just an amazing number of success stories, including examples from Brazil, including incentives put in place to support farmers in adopting low pollution practices, Chile and electrification of buses in Santiago, Colombia's investment in air quality in Medellin, and Mexico's regional approach and collaboration between ministries in Mexico City. Sergio Sanchez from EDF made a point that really stuck with me about the early work in Mexico City, where you had a situation where everybody was learning as they went while doing this massively transformational work. And Christian Tolvit from Chile said something similar about the need to build capacity while building policy in order to embed expertise into governments. Both of these points reinforce an important message. We don't have to have all the answers when we start, and you can learn as you go. And another important point is that we don't have to do this alone. Success will depend on cooperation at many levels, from local to national to regional to global. Within countries, it's critical to have cooperation between ministries and between sectors to move forward with an integrated approach. No one person or department is responsible for everything, and achieving our goals will require emission reductions in many sectors of the economy. It's also important to work with local governments, who are often the ones responsible for implementing or enforcing policy, and stakeholders at the grassroots level. Cooperation between countries is also important. Air pollution doesn't stop at national borders, and countries will need to work together in order to address transboundary air pollution. One of the long-running examples of this is the Air Convention under the UN Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE, which started to protect ecosystems and has evolved to include protections for human health. We heard a lot about the importance of regional coordination, both from very well-established perspectives like UNECE, but also new initiatives like CCAC's Africa Clean Air Program and the World Bank-supported work in South Asia and the Himalayan region. In both the CCAC and WHO meetings, we saw there's a strong appetite to work together to find solutions. I wasn't able to attend the CCAC meeting in person, but I've heard so many stories about the energy and collaborative spirit that filled the week. And the WHO conference was the same. There is such a strong interest from people around the world to share experiences and learn from each other's successes, and also the things that didn't go so well. The first meeting of UNEP's Global Coordination Network on Air Quality was held at the WHO conference. This was one of the outcomes of the UNEA 6 resolution last year, and lots of feedback was received, so hopefully we'll see proposals soon on how to move forward. And this is where I put in an advertisement for CCAC's Clean Air Task Team, which advises our work on air quality and the intersection with climate change. I'd encourage anybody interested in joining to please get in touch. In addition to working together, we heard a lot about looking after one another and the importance of considering equity in policy to ensure no one gets left behind. This is particularly relevant with respect to household energy. Huge numbers of people in many countries are still reliant on biomass for cooking or heating, and those populations are often among the most vulnerable. Solutions not only need to work in a laboratory, they need to work for the people who use them. And this is true in other sectors. One really good example given at the WHO conference was in transportation and the need to ensure public transportation is safe and accessible for those who live too far from work to benefit from walking and cycling initiatives. Finance remains a challenge in the current political environment, but there are lots of good ideas out there. Unfortunately, as Sandeep Kohli of the World Bank said, this is easy in bullet points, but harder in practice, but not impossible. This is an area where many speakers emphasize the importance of coordinated action on air quality and climate change to maximize returns, and also the need to make the economic case, to not only talk about the costs of air pollution and climate change, but also what we get from clean air in terms of increased productivity, crop yields, and other benefits. We also, as a global community, need to think about changing our approach. Multilateral development banks need to consider blended finance mechanisms, recognizing that some investments don't have direct economic returns, while others do. We should all be considering mechanisms to engage the private sector to support interventions that do have an economic return. And for countries, there's a need to consider how to redirect subsidies for fossil fuels or other sectors, taking money that is having detrimental impacts on health and the environment and putting it towards the solution. And finally, we heard many messages about the importance of communication and awareness raising. It's critical to remember the same messages won't work for all audiences, and we will need to adapt in order to find ones that resonate. One good example that was discussed at the CCAC meeting with respect to agriculture is that farmers may not be motivated by adaptation or mitigation arguments. However, they probably do connect with messaging around income, risk, labor, gender roles, and the other things that affect them on a daily basis. This is one of the benefits of integrating superpollutants into climate policies. There's something that speaks to nearly anyone's interest, whether that's climate, environment, health, food security, economic development, and so on. And when we find messages that work, we need to keep repeating them so we're bringing more people along on the journey with us. While I was away, one of my friends asked what I was doing, and I sent her one of CCAC's daily updates. And she wrote me and said, I didn't know that air pollution was the second leading risk factor in premature death. I think everybody should know that. And I wrote back, that's why I'm here. And I think that's why all of us are here. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to join you and have hoped you found this overview of the CCAC and WHO meetings useful. I'm happy to answer any questions or for you to get in touch at any time. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Amanda. Realmente sí,
Thank you very much, Amanda.
interesante todo lo que pasó en estas 2 semanas.
Everything that happened in those 2 weeks was very, very interesting. And this was not only a very detailed summary, but we also felt very excited. I particularly was actually in attendance in these 2 weeks, and I didn't just come with a lot of ideas, but also with great clarity around the path forward. And you also mentioned, why are we working in air quality and the intersection with climate change? And one of the main reasons is because it's one of the main reasons for mortality in the world. And therefore, there are many, many needs and many opportunities to continue implementing actions to reduce air pollutants into the air, and also to make progress in terms of reducing the impact of climate change. Thank you very much, Amanda, for this summary. And anyone who would like to ask Amanda a question, please write them down, and Amanda will be here to answer your questions by the end of this webinar. Amanda already mentioned that part of the discussions last week was about understanding what many countries in the region, in the Americas and other parts of the world are doing. And today we have the pleasure of having a couple of testimonies, one from Colombia and one from Mexico, two of the countries that were the first ones to include SLCPs in their NDCs. And Mexico actually was one of the countries, one of the 6 countries that started the Climate and Clean Air Coalition that currently has a very big participation of member states, but also civil society organizations and other international organizations as well. So now we will get started with the panel. We will pass the floor first to Carolina Garzón Lamprea. She is an environmental engineer with experience in mitigation of climate change and environmental management. She is an expert in the use of data for the strengthening of public policy and decision making. She currently works as a consultant for the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, focused particularly in the NDC 3.0 component. And also, Carolina and myself met in these conferences, so it's a pleasure to have you here, Carolina. My first question is, can you tell us a little bit more about what has been the history of Colombia in integrating, particularly the SLCPs in your NDCs? Can you tell us a little bit more about that in terms of its history and its current state? Because in 2022, Colombia published their national strategy for SLCPs. So it's recent, actually. However, we know that you have made great progress. We'd love to learn more about the progress in your strategy and your current status. The floor is yours, Carolina.
Claro que sí, Beatriz. Buenos días a todos. Mucho gusto, como ya
Thank you
mencionabas.
very much, Beatriz. My name is Carolina Garzón. I support the Ministry of the Environment in issues related to mitigation. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
Muy interesante resumen sobre todo lo que ha ocurrido en las últimas 2 semanas.
And it was great to hear the summary of what has happened in the last 2 weeks. We've been paying attention to the CCAC and the WHO conferences, both related to very important topics that bring us together today. I prepared a couple of slides, if I may. share with you
ha venido
that
planteando Colombia
summarizes
es una
the
gestión que
Colombian
viene desde
experience.
aproximadamente el
This is
año
something that
2018.
started since
Eh,
2018,
en temas
actually,
de contaminantes climáticos de vida
in
corta,
terms of
realmente hemos
SLCPs.
hecho bastante
We
avance,
have
sin embargo,
worked
desde
on
2018
this
más o menos venimos con
for many
productos
years now, but
y
it is
hitos
only since
muy interesantes que nos
2018 where
gustaría
milestones have
resumir
actually been
en este
achieved.
momento. Nosotros en Colombia tenemos, o
In
formulamos
Colombia,
hacia 2018, hacia finales de
in
2018, una estrategia nacional de
2018,
contaminantes climáticos de
2019,
vida corta y su
we
mitigación, con un
created a
marco y un plan de
strategy
trabajo
for
que
SLCPs
abarcaba
and
principalmente
their mitigation.
hasta
And this
2022
included a
con hitos y
framework
con grandes mensajes hasta
that
2030.
included a plan
Este
for
plan y esta
2022 and
estrategia
on to
se
2030.
incorporó con bastantes elementos
This
en el
plan and this
NDC que se
strategy
presentó en 2020
was incorporated
y
in the
algunos
NDC
hitos
that
que se
was
han venido
submitted in
desarrollando en este
2020.
sentido
And
fueron el
some of the
primero,
milestones that
inventar el
have been
indicativo de
achieved
carbono negro,
here
la
is that
primera
we created the
apuesta a nivel del
first
país en
inventory of black,
cómo contabilizar
black
esta
carbon
información, no
and the
solamente en
first
términos de
method
carbono
of how
negro, bueno,
to
parcialmente, pero ya
account
hemos
for
venido
this information.
avanzando y
Um,
tuvimos el segundo inventario hacia
the
el año
second inventory
2021 en el
was
marco del
made in
informe, del segundo
2021
informe bienal del tercer informe
in the
bienal de
framework
transparencia que
of
presentó el
the
país
second
y el año pasado
biannual report
tercer inventario
of
nacional de carbono
transparency
negro y
in the country.
contaminantes
And the
criterios que
third
se separa en marco
inventory
del
was
20R1.
presented
Es muy
in
interesante
the
para
on the
nosotros este
framework of the
trabajo y me gusta
BTR1.
resaltarlo porque adicional
So
a los
this is a
ejercicios
very
de monitoreo que
interesting
desarrollan las
progress,
ciudades,
and we love to talk about this because
contamos con
additionally
información
to the monitoring efforts
desde
that we
un nivel
have in
nacional
every
del
city
nivel de los
or in
procesos y las
certain cities,
categorías de
we
emisiones
have
que
also
tenemos para medir,
information at a national
también entender
level
cuánto estamos
that
emitiendo,
allows us to
cuánto
understand
estimamos que puede
how much are
emitirse
we emitting and
para
how much do
carbono
we
negro, para
estimate can
PM
be
2.5,
emitted
para PM10,
for
para otros
black carbon,
sustancias y
for
contaminantes, criterios muy
PM2.5, for
relevantes para el ejercicio que
PM10,
se hace
and for other
desde
substances
la
or
Dirección de Asuntos
pollutants
Ambientales en
that
torno a
are
calidad
very
del aire.
relevant to
Entonces,
the
esa
work that we do
información con
in
la que
this
contamos
ministry.
en este
So
momento y que
all
nos
of this
permite
information that we
evaluar y
have
empezar a
allows
identificar
us to
cuáles son
start
los elementos
identifying
clave para
what are
empezar a
the
gestionar
key elements
estas emisiones y
to
evaluar si
manage
nuestras iniciativas y
these
nuestras medidas
emissions and to
de
assess as well whether our
acciones de
initiatives
mitigación,
and
tanto de gases de efecto
policies
invernadero como
around
carbono negro,
mitigation
están siendo de
of
alguna manera
greenhouse
efectivas.
gases
Eh,
or black carbon are
Hemos
actually being
trabajado también en
effective.
nuevos estándares de emisión, es
We
decir, estamos con
have
varias líneas de
worked
trabajo y hemos
on
tenido
new
varios
standards
resultados bien
of
interesantes.
emissions, and we
En
have
este
been
sentido,
gathering really
quisiera
interesting
presentarles aquí
results in
algunos de
that
esos resultados.
specific
Tenemos
way.
adicional
These are
estrategias
some of the
que hemos venido
milestones that we have
trabajando también desde el
achieved,
2018
additionally to
relacionados
the
con
strategy that we
la
had
Estrategia Nacional de
since
Calidad del
2018
Aire, una Estrategia
related to
Nacional de
the
Movilidad
Air Quality
Eléctrica,
National
la
Strategy,
estrategia que ya les
a national
mencionaba de
strategy
mitigación de
for electric
contaminantes,
mobility.
criterios,
We also have
pero
the strategy that was
también
mentioning
con los
around
informes de seguimiento
the mitigation
periódicos que
of
se sacan desde el Ministerio de
SLCPs.
Ambiente
And we
y
also
que nos
have other
ayudan a
reports
enviar esos
coming from the
mensajes y
Ministry
escalar
of
esos
the
mensajes y esas
Environment that
necesidades
allow
de
us
acción.
to
Hemos
escalate
venido
these
tratando de
messages
optimizar estos
and
inventarios y estos
emphasizing the
informes
need
para
for
poder
action.
tener
We
resultados
have been
mucho más
optimizing these
accesibles a
inventories
todo
and this report
público.
so that
El
these
informe bienal
materials
de
become
transparencia
much
es
more
un
accessible
ejercicio bastante complejo.
to a
Tiene
wider
un
audience.
gran nivel de información y un gran
The
proceso de
biannual
validación y ahora
report
estamos
in
trabajando en cómo
transparency is
traer
quite
esa
a
información
complex
para que el
exercise.
público en general, para que
It
los
contains
tomadores
a
de
lot of
decisiones
information,
puedan
and now
acceder
we are
más
actually
sencilla
working
a
on
esos
how
datos
to
y
digest
entender
this
cuáles son
information
las
so that
implicaciones de cada
decision
uno de
makers and the
esos
general public
resultados.
can access it and
En
understand what the
Colombia,
implications of this
nuestra
data
NDC, como les
are.
comentaba, partió de esa estrategia y
In
de ese
Colombia, our
esfuerzo
NDC
que se realizó
started
con la Estrategia
with
Nacional de
that
Contaminantes
strategy and
Climáticos de
those
Vida
efforts
Corta y ahora la gestión
around
y el
SLCPs.
seguimiento
And
se ha
now what
enfocado en
we are
hacer con
doing
nosotros
is a management and
denominamos
follow-up
planes de
on what
implementación
we call
asociados
the
mucho
implementation
con
plans
las NDC del país, nuestras
related to
dinámicas de un
the
esquema de
Colombian
seguimiento
NDCs.
que se
Our
denomina
NDCs have a
los planes de
follow-up
implementación y seguimiento
plan
en el marco de la plataforma Más
that are
Clima y es
called
el ente
implementation and
nacional
follow-up
encargado
plans
de hacer ese
in the
seguimiento a la
framework
gestión y a las
of the
capacidades
NDC.
o a los
So we
elementos
provide
locales y
follow-up
sean
on and
responsables
manage
de sus
the
acciones a venir
capacities
desarrollando.
that we
Entonces,
have
ha
as
sido
an
muy
institution.
interesante este esfuerzo de poder alinear
This effort has
tanto
been
la
definitely
acción en
really interesting
mitigación de gases de efecto
around
invernadero como la acción en
mitigating
gestión de calidad del aire
the
y
effects of
nos hemos
greenhouse
tratado
gases
de orientar en
And we have
optimizar los esfuerzos.
oriented or
Gracias.
channeled
Nos debemos dar los
our
mensajes que
efforts
se daban en estas
around
conferencias.
optimizing the
Hay que
messages.
optimizar los esfuerzos, hay que optimizar los sistemas de seguimiento, hay que
This is
optimizar
part of
la
the
gestión
messages
que
that we were
hacemos y
listening,
la forma en la que
that we heard in
llegamos
the conferences, the
a
need for
una
optimizing
inversión
the
o a
management that we
unos
do
proyectos realmente efectivos
so that we
sobre,
can
bueno,
implement
orientados
effective action
a la reducción
based on the
de estas
investment
emisiones. Entonces,
on the
quería como
reduction
traer
of this type
estos
of
par de
emissions.
elementos pequeños para esta
So this
primera
is just a
convención.
snapshot on the milestones that were
Muchísimas
achieved
gracias,
so far.
Carolina. Creo que sí
Thank you
mostraste no
very much,
solamente el avance,
Carolina.
sino además
You
toda la
have
ruta que han
shown
seguido
not
en
only the
esta
progress,
hora.
but also
Aprovecharía
the
antes de
path,
pasar
right?
con Abraham,
Thank you so
si nos
much. We
pudieras,
appreciate it. Before
de
we
alguna de
pass the
las
floor
cosas
to Abraham,
que ustedes han desarrollado
would you mind sharing with
en
us
avances,
some of the
justamente
things that you
los
have developed
inventarios de
around
contaminantes,
those
criterios
inventories,
de
those
clasificación de de
criterion
vida corta que te permiten no solamente
pollutant
cuantificar, sino identificar sectores?
measurements
Y una de las cosas
and
que se ha
inventories?
identificado
And one of the things that
en
I
los
know that
NDCs que
has
no
been
siempre los
identified in
beneficios
the
colaterales, por ejemplo,
NDCs
en
is that
salud de
not
la
always
población,
the
en
collateral effects
protección o
in the
salud de
health
los
of
ecosistemas
populations
también, rara
or the
vez se
health of
miden.
ecosystems
¿Cómo ustedes
are
están
rarely
haciendo
measured
estos
actually.
sistemas de
So
monitoreo,
how are you including
reporte,
these
evaluación a partir de
monitoring,
estos datos?
reporting,
Naturalmente para
and
nosotros creo que es muy
evaluation
importante que tengan
systems
ya un tercer
based on this
inventario que
data?
les permita no
I imagine that
solamente
you already have all of
identificar
that,
dónde están las
but
áreas
it's
de
very
oportunidad,
important to
sino en cuanto a
understand, based
implementación,
on
pues
this third
poder
inventory, isn't
generar
it,
algo al
where
final,
the
¿no?
areas of opportunity actually
Sí,
lie.
hay dos
Can you tell
elementos
us
que
a
me
little bit about
gustaría
that?
ahí traer. El primero es,
Sure. So we have two
desde la
elements here that I'd
información
like
con la
to
que
emphasize.
nosotros contamos
First
del
is that
inventario,
based on the information that we
tenemos
have gathered from the
o
inventory,
podemos llegar a implementar metodologías
we
para
can
estimar
implement
cuáles son esos
methodologies
beneficios o
to
cuáles son
estimate
también esos
what
impactos
are
necesarios de
the
las emisiones
impacts
que tenemos
on
ya
health
medidas
in
con el
people and
inventario
environments
y cuál es la
based on
proyección de
the
la
inventory,
reducción de esos
as well as
impactos
what is the
asociadas con
projection
las medidas de
in the
mitigación.
reduction of those impacts related
Por
to
supuesto,
mitigation
sé
measures.
que México tiene
Of course, I know
mucho más
that
de experiencia,
Mexico
bastante más experiencia que
is
nosotros y estamos
a little
tratando
bit, or actually
desde
a
el
lot more
Ministerio de
experienced than us
implementar una
in
metodología que nos
implementing this type of
permita
methodology. So, from the ministry
estimar
in Colombia,
cuáles son
we are
esas
trying to
reducciones
implement a methodology as
específicas
well
y
that
esos
would allow us
beneficios
to
y
estimate what
plantear esa
the
metodología
specific reductions would entail and what the benefits as well
nacional
for that
y
methodology
cuáles
would be
podrían ser los resultados.
at a
Actualmente
national
estamos
level
en en
first,
esa
and then what the
construcción de
results could be
lineamientos de cómo
around that.
abordarlo.
So we are
Hay
now in the phase
bastantes
of
estudios
building the
realizados aquí también
guidelines
en Colombia. Lo que
around how
queremos es
to approach this.
recogerlos y poder plantear un
What we
esquema
are
a
aiming to
manera de
do is to
protocolo que
gather
nos
all of
permita
this
también
so that we can build a
periódicamente no
protocol
solamente tener
that allows
información de
us
cuáles son las
to
emisiones, sino cuáles son los
regularly
efectos o
gather
cuáles son las
information
decisiones
that
que
allows us to
beneficios les
understand
causa
what the emissions are,
estas
but
acciones de
also what the
mitigación.
effects are and the
Colombia
benefits of
sí ha
the
realizado
mitigation
un
efforts.
análisis de no
Colombia
solamente
has
cuántas
done
emisiones
some
tenemos
analysis
por
around
las acciones de mitigación o cuáles
the
son las reducciones,
emissions
sino cuál es su
that
relación con
the
las
reduction
emisiones
of
de
emissions
carbono
based on
negro.
the measures that we
Y
have taken, but also
fíjate
what the
aquí
relationship
en la
is
parte
with
superior de esta
black
gráfica derecha
carbon.
hay unos punticos
So
que
when you
estaban por
see, for
encima.
example, this
Son acciones de
graph,
mitigación
those
de gases
dots
de
on
efecto
top,
invernadero
these
que tienen un
are
impacto negativo
actions,
en
mitigation
las
actions on
emisiones de
greenhouse
carbono negro, es decir, son
gases
medidas que reducen sí
that
gases de
have a
efecto
negative
invernadero, pero que
impact.
nos están generando un incremento en las
So
emisiones de carbono negro. Entonces,
measures
cómo
that are
nosotros
actually
también estamos
reducing
incluyendo
um,
y analizando como
GHGs,
de las dos
but
maneras
are
esas
actually
acciones de
increasing
mitigación
black
para
carbon,
poder
right?
generar
So
estrategias
that's
un
an
poco más
interesting
complejas.
question
Entonces,
to analyze
por
that
un
makes
lado,
these
tener esas guías y poder
policies to
establecer
be
unos
implemented in
apoyos
a
también
little
a nivel
more
nacional para
complex
hacer
way. So
seguimiento
it's good
continuo
to
y
have a
también
specific
tener, por
guideline
otra parte, los
and
datos
protocol at
de
a national
auditoría y los
level,
datos
but it's also
principalmente
critical
asociados
to have
a las
data
entidades de
in
salud.
other
Ellos
territories and
son
other
propiamente los que recaudan, los que
areas
entienden
that
cuáles
can
son los
gather
impactos
the
que
data
están pasando
locally because
en
they
los
understand
territorios y ven
what the
si se
impact
están o
is
no
in the
cambiando, se están
territory,
modificando estas tendencias.
and they can
Entonces,
see whether there is a
tienen
trend
que tener
that
en
is
este
actually
protocolo
improving.
esas dos correlaciones, tanto la
So I
materia
believe
más
that we need to have these
la
two
gestión de la
actions
calidad del aire, pero
correlated.
también lo que
So
tenemos desde los
actions
impactos en
around
salud.
air
Y allí
quality,
tenemos que
but
encontrar
also
la
data
forma de
around the impact on
correlacionar
health.
y de tener
And we
esta
need to find a
información y
way
que
to
se hable de alguna
correlate
manera y los mensajes
this
puedan llegar
data
a todos, porque
and
a
have
pesar de
them
que hemos en los
communicate so
inventarios,
that the
pero en
messaging
los
also
territorios
reflects that.
y en las comunidades siguen habiendo
Because
impactos,
if
entonces
we
hay
continue
algo
to
que
see
tenemos
this
que
impact
tomar.
in other
Eso es
territories,
lo
that
que
can tell us
podría
that that there's something that we are perhaps not implementing correctly. So that's kind of what I can say to that question.
Sí, definitivamente
Thank you very much, Carolina. Having the data is definitely super important. The other thing is to build the impact indicators, right, as you were saying. And as you well said, it's important to have the information and to know where is it being implemented, and ideally to have the territories that are positively impacted based on the policies that have been implemented. Now that you mentioned the Mexican experience, I believe that Colombia and Mexico have not only been pioneers, but they share many, many experiences actually. So we will now pass the floor to Abraham Martinez, who is currently the General Coordinator on Reference Laboratories from the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change of Mexico. And Abraham has a very important professional background around research on SLCPs, climate change, and air quality. He also has worked as a public officer in air quality, and he's been part of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and he was also a consultant on SLCPs. Abraham was also in attendance in the Brasilia conference at CCAC, and I hope, Abraham, you also came back energized. And what I would like to ask you, Abraham, is in your experience, what are the considerations around health impact on NDCs, and how have they been integrated? Or have they been integrated? Because the idea is to have climate action that is not only solid and robust, but also more efficient, right? Hi, Betty. Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Perfecto. Pues muchas gracias a
Yes, we
WRI.
can hear you. Well, thank you very much to WRI. Thank you to all of the colleagues. I enjoyed listening to Carolina, and that I have been following in terms of her activities and what Colombia is been doing. So thank you for your question. I'll try to keep this brief. So as you mentioned, Mexico has been a pioneer in these efforts. And of course, people need to know that you, Beatriz, were one of the first people in Mexico who were working around these SLCPs to be included in our NDCs. So there are many colleagues that have been involved in pushing this idea around pollutants. And I think that we need to be clear on the fact that many of the stakeholders here in Mexico that are currently involved in climate came from air quality. And that is a thing that we need to be clear on. The history of pollution starts first. Climate change already had some elements there, but when we reached the Paris Accords, many of these things came from air quality. So air quality has been working on in Mexico for many, many years, and it became more robust when we started a tri-national effort with Mexico, Canada, and the United States. As you were asking, Carolina, we also worked on strengthening the inventories to identify and understand the sources of pollutants. So this was an effort to understand in depth the actions around mitigation. So we have a path already walked on in terms of mitigation, because obviously at the time we were super focused on reducing particles, particularly ozone. So coming into mitigation from the perspective of combustion, because
habíamos analizado, y eso creo que también fue una trayectoria junto contigo y varios colaboradores, tratar de tener fuentes, tratar de tener la caracterización de las partículas para ver composición, y de ahí entendimos qué fuentes eran importantes para carbono negro. Entonces, creo que la trayectoria de cambio climático y calidad en el NDC, pues es ahora, justamente lo hemos dicho, es bidireccional. ¿En qué sentido? Hoy en día, con el apoyo de la Coalición de Clima Aire Limpio, que soy
is
que también
is a
agradecer,
bi-directional
recibió un gran
effort.
soporte
So,
para
with the
este tema,
support
pues
of the
finalmente
Climate
integramos
Change
junto con
Coalition, which has been a great support for
Estuvimos
Mexico,
trabajando,
we
pudimos
have
integrar
been able
todas
to
las emisiones
integrate
de
this to
gases
the
de efecto
models.
invernadero, el
So we were
NDC,
able to integrate all of these
alrededor del
emissions
inventario de gases de efecto
of
invernadero, ya
all
lo
of these greenhouse gas
definimos. ¿Y
emissions
qué hicimos? Pues
into the
pusimos los
NDCs.
contaminantes
And what we
atmosféricos,
did
integrar
is
todos,
we
ver por
placed
supuesto
the
los rayos
atmospheric
químicos y
pollutants,
aporte de los
in
océanos, que
general,
son
all of
fotoquímicos,
them.
pero todos los precursores.
Ozone,
¿Y
no,
eso qué
because
nos
it's a
implica en términos del cumplimiento que
photochemical,
hablabas,
but all of the
rapidez o
precursors we did.
la trayectoria que tendríamos para hacer más rápida la mitigación?
So, in terms
Pues lo
of what
hemos
we can
comentado en
do
varios
in order
foros.
to be more
Desde
effective,
la óptica
this is
climática
something that
no hay
has been
manera de
discussed in
mitigación. Por ejemplo, la
various forums.
electromovilidad está hoy en
From
día,
the
es muy clara
climate
la cifra de
perspective,
electromovilidad.
we have mitigation
Entonces,
measures,
si
right?
tú hablabas
And we
antes de
understand
salir de cambio
that
climático, por ejemplo,
electromobility
todos en
is
transporte
a very
público,
important
¿no?
piece
Todos
of it.
conocemos
When you
estos
talk to
transportes hoy en día acá en
climate change
Colombia, en
people,
Chile, en
they
México,
understand that public transportation is a very important piece of the solution.
sí,
In
perfecto.
Colombia, in Chile, in Mexico,
Finalmente
we
estamos
see these
viendo cómo
BRTs now,
este
and
transporte
we are
nació aquí
seeing
en
how
Latinoamérica
this
y
transport
empezó con
started in
motores
Latin
diésel, ¿no?
America
Hoy
and
en día,
started with
si hubieras hablado en
diesel
esos ayeres con
engines.
algunos de calidad del aire,
If
oye, es
you
que se van a
discuss
degradar nuestros
this with
motores,
people
porque
from air
están
quality
sacando
at the
muchas
time,
partículas,
whether these
nosotros
engines
vamos a sacar
were
filtros de
emitting a lot
partículas.
of
Y hoy en
particles,
día
they
ya
would
tenemos
add perhaps
estrategias de
particle
electromovilidad que
filters.
pueden hablar ya
But
de
now
transición de
we
de
have
transportes a
electromobility strategies
eléctricos.
that
Entonces, si no había
speak
esta conectividad,
about the
seguramente la
transition
inversión en algunos
to
casos hubiera
electric
sido, no, ponemos
transportation.
filtros de partículas
So
y con
if we
esto
didn't have this
reducimos la
connectivity,
emisión, cuando hoy en
maybe
día ya
we
se
would
habla de
have
calidad de
just
cambio
talked
climático, dices,
about
bueno, pues tenemos
particle
electromovilidad y
filters. But
creemos
now,
electromovilidad y
since
creemos
we have
beneficios
this
ahora
connection
la
with
calidad.
climate change,
Entonces creo
we can
que ese tipo de
also
estrategias ya
talk
empiezan
more
a hablarse
seriously around electromobility
principalmente
and the
de calidad de
benefits
cambio climático.
for those
Algo que hay
measures around air
que dejar
quality.
muy claro, Betty, y esto
Something that
también
we also
tomando en
need to
consideración las
understand,
reuniones de
Betty,
Brasilia, que me
and taking into
mencionó mucho,
consideration
es que seguimos
the
todavía
meeting in
en todos los
Brasilia,
países de la región
I was very
teniendo áreas
surprised
de
that
calidad del aire
many of the
sanitariamente,
countries in
no
the
se
region,
hablan de manera
in the areas
fluida, nos
of
conocemos, a
the
veces
areas of air
hablamos de
quality
cada
and climate
semana, pero no
change,
nos
are
sentamos realmente a
not
tener esta
sitting at the same table for
comunicación. En
discussions.
México
Sometimes we know of it, of
pudimos
each other,
romperla afortunadamente,
but
entonces hoy en
there is a
día
lack, there's
muchos de
a
los
gap there that
colaboradores de
needs to
calidad del
be
aire están en cambio
bridged.
climático y
Fortunately, in
viceversa,
Mexico,
¿no?
we were
Otros
have been able
obviamente también
to
están en temas, por ejemplo,
bridge
seguridad
that
alimentaria.
gap
Entonces me puedo
in a
ver que ya
way,
tenemos toda una conectividad
which is really
y
good
eso
because
creo que
now we
rompe
have a
las barreras para
connectivity between
justamente
these
tratar
two
establecer
working
ya reuniones
groups,
de
and
clima
that
rápidas.
breaks down the
Entonces creo que esa es
barriers in
una de las
order
cosas
to
que yo
build
retomo de Brasilia,
faster paths. So this
el
is something
romper
that I
barreras
came
puede
back
llevar a detonar
with
procesos
from
mucho más rápidos.
Brasilia, that
Por ejemplo,
breaking
hablamos
down
aquí
these
en Colombia
barriers
está
can allow
el
us
caso de
to
México,
trigger
la
faster
normatividad que
and more
hablaba
efficient
en un
processes.
foro justamente hace unos días,
My last
nos decía,
comment is around
¿por qué
normativity.
no pensamos en que la
I
regulación de
was
calidad del aire
discussing
en
with
algún
some
momento
colleagues
se
around
puede
why
beneficiar al
not
cambio climático?
discuss
Entonces, por ejemplo, las normas de eficiencias
the fact that
energéticas
regulation around
en
air
términos de
quality can
reducción de
benefit climate change.
contaminantes podría ser un
So, for
efecto
example,
positivo para las emisiones de
the
gases de efecto
norms
invernadero, una
around
reducción. El programa
vehicles can have
por
also a
ejemplo, el
positive
que se ha hecho en
impact
la zona
on
metropolitana de Cali de
greenhouse gas
México,
emissions, for
que viene de
example.
calidad del aire,
So, the
Betty, y
program
creo
that
que
we
hay una
have in the
gráfica
metropolitan area
que
in
ahorita les puedo
Mexico
mostrar,
City
que creo que
that
les va a
comes
impresionar a
from air
todos,
quality
siempre la
departments.
mostramos, la voy a
And
compartir de
actually,
manera
I have
relevante,
here a
a
quick
ver si
graph that is
si la
quite
podemos ver, a ver
a
si se
shock
puede.
to everyone that
No
sees
sé si
this.
ya están viendo mi pantalla.
I don't know if you can see my screen right now.
No, aún no.
No, not yet.
No sé si puedo compartir. Ah, ya, aquí está. Ok. Esta gráfica nada más la vamos a poner ahí muy rápidamente. ¿Sí se ve?
Okay,
Sí,
I'm sharing this
aquí la,
graph right now.
eso, mira. Ujú.
Bueno, esta es histórica y esto es algo que desde calidad del aire yo siempre lo llevo a los foros de cambio
This is a
climático. Este es el mejor
historic
ejemplo
graph, and this
de la
I always bring
política
this
de
to
calidad del
climate
aire que
change
podría
conferences.
dar
This is the best
resultados
example
como lo estamos
of
haciendo en
air
nuestro
quality
país. Esto
policies
hablamos de
that can have
1990, las
short-term
concentraciones de ozono,
impacts. We're talking about here
históricamente se
1990 to 2019. These are the ozone concentrations historically in Mexico City. Those who grew up during this time, we were playing football in the streets with concentrations of 300 ppb. I mean, can't imagine our condition right now, but the actions around air quality were able to make a change in a period of 20, 25 years. And I always bring this to the table because in air quality, or from air quality, we can demonstrate how air quality policies can have actually a very positive impact on climate change. And this should be paired with the fact that these work together with other programs. Now, the uh, car fleets in Mexico City are very new, one of the newest that exists right now. And there's a lot of migration towards hybrid and electric cars. And this is a very good trend that we are trying to reinforce. And this was not a climate policy, this was an air quality policy first. So when we talk to our climate change colleagues, we always tell them that this is what we are aiming for. This is the same type of trajectory that we want to demonstrate. So we should always push towards this direction. And the NDCs for climate change should have both climate and air quality elements in joint models or joint protocols that could allow to see which of those strategies can allow you to have a shorter impact, a faster impact in a shorter time. This is another graph that I'd like to share in terms of the strategies that we were doing around integrating SLCPs into NDCs. The first thing that we did was to identify the sectors that generate ozone, particularly those that generate black carbon, and which ones can generate greenhouse gas emissions and have a benefit on air quality. Sorry for rushing through this one, but that's all that I can say. Thank you very much, Abraham. You mentioned around a more connection between air quality and climate change. And those who were last week in Cartagena were happy to hear about this. We're happy to hear about greater communication with the health ministry. There's an increasing communication with this ministry so that we can see all the benefits in air quality and health. And at the same time, you can have important reduction around reducing climate change rates. So, understanding the progress that has been done around integrating climate change policies, particularly around health impacts, and even considering all of the progress that Mexico has made, what are, in your view, the challenges? In the last 2 weeks, we heard and discussed a lot about funding, but we'd like to hear from you around this. This is a very important moment for Mexico. So what are the challenges that you identify? Yeah, this is very true. In terms of funding, we are subject to the fact that many of these measures are actually technologically based, and this technology requires investment. So that is a challenge, that's a risk in terms that we might not have the correct investment to reach that point. For example, Mexico is currently developing its own electric transportation, competing with Asian countries mainly. So what is the main challenge there? That we may not have the technological self-sufficiency to build our own transportation. So it is a technological issue and an investment issue. And unfortunately, with the tariff problem that we currently have, that could become as well a barrier around a very big barrier around having access to this type of technology and in building the transportation that we want. So the landscape is not easy right now, and we need to be much clearer on where do we want our investments to go. And something that you also mentioned around Colombia and in Cartagena is that something that we are doing in Mexico is, or I would like to ask, how many of everyone here have made evaluations on health and air quality and climate change, or both? This is something we heard of in Cartagena, because what you are not investing in air quality, you will have to invest it in health. So this is an interesting cost-benefit analysis around investment, because anything that you are not investing in improving air quality, you'll pay it in health. So this is a very important piece of the narrative that we need to communicate in terms of perhaps strategies that are not being done around economic funding. What are the risks in terms of health? So we have that image of the brick factories. Perhaps it's not relevant as a big sector, but it has a very important problem locally, which is the lack of investment around that. The population that works in that industry will have very serious health problems. So this type of cost-benefit analysis are really interesting, and they should be on the table. And this is something that is not necessarily discussed in climate change or air quality. Thank you very much, Abraham. We'll come back with Carolina for a minute. And the question for you, Carolina, is what tools are you building or using to meet your commitments or to establish milestones? As Abraham was saying, this assessment around the health and the impact on health and the cost-benefit analysis around that is a very interesting conversation around vulnerable populations, right? So, Carolina, what have you been doing in Colombia around resources, tools? And then Abraham can also perhaps add his comment. And I'd like to also add Amanda to this, because we know that the Clean Air flagship by the Equivex platform is currently incorporating some tools that can be useful for goal setting, for evaluation, or for simply the implementation of the mission. So I'll just start with Carolina, Abraham, and finally Amanda, please. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you, Abraham, for these comments and for the very clear messaging around messaging on the coordination of air quality and climate change. Well, to answer the question, Colombia has, for many years, it started to create a monitoring system nationally, which is the model of NDCs that not only allows for an analysis of mitigation efforts for greenhouse gas emissions, but also linked to black carbon. This has been a very big effort, actually, because it is not easy to articulate these factors. And the creation of the inventories requires as well a team that is constantly monitoring and updating the data. So we have lagged behind, actually, where we would like to be. We are trying to work in terms of to have a articulated model from the Hydrology and Meteorology Institute here in Colombia, who is the institution in charge of managing these national inventories. So what they are working on is in precisely articulating this tree of emission categories so that they can also align the efforts that we have around criteria pollutants. And that is a first step to start having a common language, which is a very aligned comment to one of the questions that we were looking at in the chat in terms of how can we have clear lines around how to monitor black carbon, for example, in climate pollutants. Colombia is taking steps in terms of creating a structure and to think about where do we have coincident elements and where do we have to make adjustments around monitoring structures, because the methodologies at the end of the day are the same, but we need to understand where are they reflected in each of the branches of this tree. So that on the one side, around unifying the analysis and the evaluation of the data, either on a model or not. And on the other hand, Colombia and the technical teams in the ministries, here the initiatives and the proposals and studies that come from various NGOs and other entities, for example. So we receive their messages around air quality, around different models, and all of that is super useful for us because this exercise of analysis across institutions is a good feedback process to allow us to understand how to assess correctly and to course correct if needed. So it's not only about the tools that are developed locally, but also what are the instruments that we can have access to. And that's a limitation as well. We would all like and love to go more in depth and try to understand all of the studies that are out there. But whatever we can get in and whatever messages we can actually bring in that are solid, we will use them because they are super useful. Likewise, we use the information coming from international organizations, elements coming from the Global Carbon Project. For example, Colombia has been trying to establish actions and establish some sort of dynamics around the follow-up of the mitigation related to black carbon. In that sense, important to understand what's happening at international level. One of those elements is the methane global emissions. So we would like to bring in those elements and to see how we can incorporate it into the national management. So there are various levels around these elements. What is developed at a level of the academia, at a level of the national government, and also internationally. And the idea is how can we bring in the scientific information that has been developed and we can interpret it and implement it in our national policies. Thank you, Carolina. And that is a very important point as well, right? How it is that academia, civil society organizations have worked together with governments for many, many years, locally and internationally, to share locally and to understand the needs that they both share. So thank you very much for emphasizing that point. Abraham, what can you tell us about tools, resources that you're using, and perhaps as Carolina just did, to make a call, right, to receive more resources and more information. And then we'll pass the floor to Amanda so that she can tell us what resources are there out there that we can also use. Well, something that we discussed in Brasilia, which is always great to go to this type of spaces because new tools are always shared, new strategies are presented. I was able to have conversations with many colleagues from different organizations that they develop platforms, they develop methodologies that at the end of the day can be transferred and used elsewhere. And I think that whether you are in academia or in research, you don't necessarily know what other tools are there that can allow you to shorten the times of implementation or research. For example, there's a piece of satellite methodologies that is very linked now in order to establish whether there are impacts on greenhouse gas emission reduction. These are tools that are part of research projects, and many NGOs have found pragmatic uses to this. So this connectivity is something that we would love to have more, so that we can have more elements that allow for better decision making and immediate action. Great, thank you, Abraham. And Amanda, could you tell us what can we learn or what resources, tools are out there that are being used by Clean Air Flagship, for example, particularly the QMEX platform?
Sure. So the AQMX platform is the Air Quality Management Exchange, and it can be found at aqmx.org. And what this is essentially a one-stop shop for air quality management guidance that's been developed by CCAC in conjunction with air quality managers. And it's organized around kind of 8 key areas of the air quality management process. So starting with monitoring, emissions inventory, source attribution, health impact assessment, sustainable development benefits assessment, decision support, public engagement and communication, and legal framework, policy design, and implementation. And so the curated guidance has been developed by experts, and right now what's available is stage 1. So it's the very basic kind of, if you want to start air quality management, where do you begin? The goal is to release stages 2 and 3 later this year, with stages 4 and 5 to follow. And so at that point, you'll have a whole suite of guidance. And what it does is it walks you step by step of the process you will take. And it also links through a resource library to loads of various tools and resources and documents and studies that you can reference to support your work. And so Abraham was talking about the importance of understanding the health impacts of your policies, and that if you're not investing in air quality, you're going to be spending that money in kind of treating the health problems that are caused by poor air quality. So through AQMX, you can access WHO's AirQ Plus tool or the US EPA's BenMap tool, both of which will give you kind of the ability to do kind of analysis of the health impacts of your policies. We're very interested in this not being a static tool, that it is kind of informed by the community. And so where you have resources and success stories, we're very happy for you to share those and for those to be incorporated in the resource library. And over the course of this year, we're also very interested in developing kind of regional chapters of AQMX to inform kind of regional specific information that would be valuable to share. And also starting to develop sectoral guidance where we develop, because all of the policies will eventually require kind of controls at a sectoral level. And so developing guidance on how you go about implementing those.
Muchas gracias, Amanda. Y justamente mencionaste algo
Thank you
que
very much,
me gustó
Amanda. And
mucho.
you mentioned
Es que hay
something
muchas
extremely
que
important.
utilizar.
Many of the
Sin
tools
duda,
that
la
are
experiencia de
out there we
México y
can already
Colombia para a lo
use.
mejor un
And
stage
the
3 a lo mejor van a
experience
ser
in
muy,
Mexico
muy
and Colombia,
necesarios
perhaps for a
y
stage
estaremos
3 or stage 4, that
integrando
will
nuestras
be
materias que ya están
extremely
y el
interesting
reporte
to
y
use the
información.
tools that are
Entonces,
already out
con esto
there
yo
and
cierro el
perhaps
panel. Le
some of the
doy
other
crédito a mi
suggestions.
colega Saúl
Thank you
Pereira,
very much.
que
With
nos va a
this, I
ayudar
will close my
a
participation
traer
with this
las
panel.
preguntas
I will now
para
pass the floor to
participantes de
my
la sesión
colleague Saul
participantes,
Pereira,
por
who will
favor.
bring the questions from our participants and
Abramos esto
attendees.
a una
So let's
intercambio
open this
preguntas y
webinar
comentarios. Entonces,
to
con
a
esto,
discussion
Saúl, te dejo
and
a ti el
opportunity
foro
for
de la sesión.
questions.
Muchas
Saul, the
gracias
floor
a
is
los
yours.
panelistas.
Thank you very much to our
Muchísimas gracias,
panelists.
Betty, por esta excelente moderación.
Thank you
Creo
so
que
much,
la verdad es que hemos encontrado esta
Betty.
conversación tan
Sorry.
interesante
I believe
y
that
aprovechar el
this was a
máximo
very, very
el
interesting
tiempo
conversation you
que
just
Carolina
moderated,
y
and
Bárbara
also we
nos han dedicado
have
esta mañana.
made good use of the time of Carolina, Abraham, and
Quisiera
Amanda. Thanks so
empezar,
much.
tenemos varias preguntas. Trataré de ir
Let's start with the
contestándolas
questions.
ahora
I'll try
sí
to
en
go
orden de
through them
aparición
in order.
y quisiera iniciar
And the
directamente
first
con una
question
pregunta que tenemos para ti,
is
Amanda.
for Amanda.
La pregunta es, ¿cómo puede
The
la
question
colaboración
is, how
internacional
can the international
ayudar a los países de
cooperation
Latinoamérica
help Latin
a
American
abordar
countries
aquellos retos vinculados con la
in
reducción de contaminantes químicos de
approaching
vida corta
the
de una manera
challenges
más eficaz?
around SLCPs in a much more efficient way?
I think one of the interesting things that's kind of come out of the last 2 weeks is the fact we all are facing the same challenges to varying degrees and are at different points along the journey, but we're all on the same journey. And so I think international cooperation is a really good opportunity to learn from what others are doing, but also learn from what didn't work. We heard that quite a lot, is that where somebody has tried something and it wasn't successful, sharing that with others is very useful to kind of help them save time and kind of moving forward in a positive way.
Muchas gracias, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that answer. We have several questions here, so let's move on. This one's for Carolina. How has the interaction between environment sectors and health sectors to estimate the benefits of mitigating
Bueno, hay
SLCPs?
una conversación fluida entre los
Well, there is a
ministerios de
very
salud y los
fluid
ministerios de ambiente, especialmente desde el ambiente
conversation between
académico,
these
donde
ministries,
tenemos un grupo
particularly
allá
in the
que
line
nos
of
mantiene,
climate
digamos, en
change,
conversación.
where the intersection
Entonces, hemos
exists.
trabajado, por ejemplo,
And
el
we
Ministerio
have
de Salud está
been
muy
working
interesado en
with the
reflejar
Ministry of
los
Health,
impactos en
who
salud
is
de cada
very
una de las
interested
acciones de
in
mitigación.
reflecting
Entonces,
the
estamos
health
tratando de
impacts of each of the actions of mitigation. So we
replicar ese
are
mensaje en los otros
trying to
sectores
replicate
para
that
que se
message
puedan
in other sectors as well,
efectivamente poder
so that
identificar,
we can
cuantificar y ver
specifically
precisamente esos posibles
identify,
impactos, porque es algo que
quantify,
tenemos que poner
and follow up
también
on
en la
these
mesa de
impacts, because this is something
conversaciones, no
that needs
solamente
to
cuáles son los
be
beneficios
on the
como tal,
table.
sino cómo
Not
estamos
only
o qué es lo que
what
estamos
is the
atrayendo
mitigation
o
benefit,
beneficiando en
but
términos de
also
salud,
what is the
están los
benefit for
estudios que
public
están
health.
realizando y
And
aplicándose desde los ministerios y desde
the
los
studies
equipos
that
de
are
salud
being
para
performed from the
en
ministries
este ejercicio que les comento que
will
estamos
be
haciendo desde el
integrated
Ministerio de
in
Ambiente,
this
plantear unos lineamientos
exercise
y
that
unos
I'm
guías
saying.
para
So we
poder
are
evaluar
creating certain
periódicamente
guidelines
los
and
impactos en
certain
salud de las acciones de
ways
mitigación.
of
Entonces, esa es la
evaluating the
conversación
impact on
que hemos
health
tenido
from
realmente
mitigation actions.
de manera
This is an
continua durante
ongoing
todo el proceso.
conversation with these
No
ministries, and
repetir
the
el
idea
discurso, sino
is
hacer uso de lo
to
que ya se ha
not
venido desarrollando en estos
duplicate efforts,
ministerios.
but build on what has already been
Gracias, Carolina.
created.
Muy importante, no solo
Thank you
la
very much,
conversación interna,
Carolina.
sino
Very,
también
very
en este
important not only
ámbito
to
que
talk
también es
about the
muy relevante.
cross-cutting nature of the topic, but
Para
also to talk
Abraham,
about
yo
these
tengo un par
guidelines.
de preguntas. ¿Dónde podemos
Question
conocer
for Abram.
las mejoras que
Where
hay
can we learn
o habrá en
about
cuanto a
the
los inventarios de emisiones y monitoreo entre
improvements
México, Estados
that
Unidos y Canadá
exist or that will
adicional?
exist in the emission inventories monitoring from Mexico,
Lo que
US, and
hemos estado
Canada?
haciendo es justamente incorporar esto
Okay,
en los
what we
modelos
have
en el
been
modelo
doing is incorporating
los
this
datos
in
ya de
the LIB
actividad
model.
que hemos venido
The
desarrollando en
data that
México,
of
es decir,
activities that we have
factores de
been
emisiones
developing in
locales.
Mexico is
Con
to
mucho gusto,
develop
esos son parte de
local
los
emission
documentos
factors.
oficiales, se pueden
This is part
compartir, que
of the
son
official documents
ya, por
that
ejemplo,
I
factores de
can
emisiones
gladly
de
share
sectores
with you all.
como
We can
leña,
talk
algunos
about emission
sectores como
factors
transporte,
in certain
algunas
sectors like
industrias, por ejemplo, altamente contaminantes,
transport, some
ladrilleras, esos
other
son las
industries that
mejoras.
are
La
highly
metodología
pollutant. So
sigue
that's part
siendo la
of the
misma
improvements.
y
The
en el caso
methodology is
del
still the same
IPCC,
though.
pues se están
And in
incorporando
the
todavía
case of the
ahorita
IPCC,
datos
uh,
locales. Entonces eso
we are
también está dentro de los
incorporating
reportes que
more
México vamos
local
a
data
requerir
as well.
también.
So that's also part of the reports that Mexico is
Gracias, Abraham.
sending
Ok,
to
muy
the
bien, ya con
framework
eso
convention.
voy a ir otra vez contigo. La siguiente
Great.
pregunta me
Coming back
pareció
to
relevante en
Abraham, there's
términos
another
de la
question for you
operatividad.
in terms
La
of
pregunta es, en el caso de México,
operativity.
¿de
In the case of
qué forma
Mexico,
consideran que debería de verse reflejado
how
el
do
esfuerzo de
you
las
think
empresas
the effort
en
of
su
companies
compromiso
should
para
be
reducir este tipo de
reflected
contaminantes?
and their
¿Se
commitment
habrá
to
o
reduce
se
this type of
requiere una
pollutants?
política similar a la del
Is
impuesto al
there a
carbono para
discussion
componentes más
around a
específicos?
policy around carbon tax or other
Yo creo
specific
que aquí
pollutants?
justamente es un reto que tenemos hoy en día
Well,
con
this is a very
la
big challenge
industria.
indeed that we have with the
Entendemos las
industry.
políticas sustentables que
We
tienen
understand
su gran
the
mayoría relacionadas con los compromisos
sustainable policies
climáticos
that they
y
have,
creo que ahí tenemos una
many of
gran área de
them
oportunidad,
based
de
on
hecho puedes
climate
detallar ahí, por
change
ejemplo,
commitments. And I believe
el
that's
hecho
where
de
we
que se
have a big
cumpla ya con
opportunity
los
around air
compromisos de
quality.
reducción o
The fact
sustentabilidad,
that
no
the
necesariamente están relacionados
reduction
con emisiones de
commitments
contaminantes. Te puedo
are
decir
there
que
around
muchas veces,
sustainability, but
aunque
they
se
are not
cumpla con
necessarily
cierta
related to
normatividad
pollutant
vigente,
emissions.
ya van
So
acompañados, por ejemplo, las partículas de algunos
the
tóxicos
normativity
que
sometimes
no
already
necesariamente requieres a que
includes
estén bajo norma y
certain
finalmente
toxic
pues el
particles.
carbono negro puede que no están
So
regulados y que
things like
finalmente
black
eso
carbon
nos
that are
impulsa
not
mucho y
regulated
que nosotros nos
and can
faltaría
be
desarrollar
considered
un poco más las
a
estrategias. Creo
public
que
health issue can allow us
podríamos,
to
por ejemplo, con un
reinforce the
mayor
strategies
acercamiento con la
with the
industria,
private
mayor
industry.
capacidad de diálogo
Um,
y
so
tratar de
we
decir
should
que, por
increase
ejemplo,
our
las
capacity of dialogue
estrategias
with them
climáticas
and
o
trying to
las
say
iniciativas
that, for
climáticas
example, the
también
climate
deberían
strategies
ayudar
or
a la
investment
mitigación de los
strategies
contaminantes
around climate should
a
also
principalmente
impact
criterios
on
y
the
si
mitigation
podemos llegar a
of
específicos, qué
atmospheric
bueno.
pollutants.
Por ejemplo, cementeras,
Mainly the criteria,
las
but
cementeras
if we can
siguen
reach the toxic
trabajando con
elements,
mucho esfuerzo,
much better.
obviamente bajo las condiciones
Particularly,
del
for
proceso
example,
de
cement
combustión, pues qué
plants
alternativas
that
también,
have
qué
this very
soluciones hay, no
highly
solo desde la reducción de gases
combustive
de efecto invernadero,
process.
pueden ir aplicando
What are
ahí,
the
y dos,
alternatives that we
otros
can work with them
componentes.
so
Sabemos que hay
that
procesos
we
en los
can
cuales ellos
reduce the
planifican
emission of
su
certain certain commitment, pollutants. We know that they already have certain processes in place, but I believe we still need to go much further. So we would talk about multiple benefits
Muchas
around
gracias, Abraham.
industry right there. Thank
Creo que hay
you,
mucho todavía por hacer,
Abraham.
pero
There's
bueno, creo que
always
afortunadamente
so many
ya
things to
estamos
do,
en
right?
el tercio.
But
Carolina, aquí hay una
fortunately,
pregunta
we are
que
making
retoma un poco
progress.
del que
So,
comentó
Carolina, there's
la
another
conferencia
question
en
here
Brasil y tiene que ver sobre
based on the conference in
qué
Brazil.
iniciativas existen
What
para contabilizar los
initiatives
contaminantes
exist
climáticos de vida corta dentro de los
to
marcos relacionados a
measure
los mercados de carbono voluntarios, sí
SLCPs
o
related
obligatorios?
to
Y hacen referencia al artículo 6 del Acuerdo de
carbon
París, el
markets,
19,
voluntary and
etcétera. Tal
mandatory,
vez
and
nos puedas
there's
compartir
reference
tu
to the
visión
Paris
y
Accords,
a lo mejor
etc. Perhaps you can share your vision around
Amanda
that, and
amplía
maybe
seguidamente.
also Amanda could add to that as well.
Bueno, en Colombia se está trabajando
Well, yeah,
en
in Colombia,
varios
we
elementos.
are
Primero la
working
reglamentación a
with
nivel del mundo
various elements here.
para la
First,
implementación y
the
para la puesta en marcha del
creation
artículo
of
6.
guidelines
Tenemos
around the
instrumentos como
implementation
el
and
canal
Article
de
6
emisión, el
implementation. So
registro
we have
nacional de
instruments
emisiones,
around the
para
National
revelar y
Registry of
presentar sobre
Emissions.
las
We
iniciativas
also have the
que pretenden llegar
mandatory
a alguna forma de
registry
pago por
of
resultados o también en descarga de los
pollutants
mercados de carbono. Por el momento, el
that
marco
impact on
normativo que
market
nosotros tenemos
carbon
que se está
markets.
construyendo
However, for the time
actualmente es la
being,
plataforma
the normative
quantitative que se
framework
presentó en
is
Invernadero.
only
Aquí entraría,
laid
por ejemplo, el
out in
metano
terms
como
of
un
greenhouse
elemento que
gas
podría
emissions.
ser
Methane is
parte
one of the
de
elements that
reducción
could
del
be part of
mercado de
this
carbono,
exercise as well for
principalmente
carbon markets,
en
particularly
elementos como biogás en rellenos animales
in
o otro
other
tipo
elements
de
like
iniciativas
biogas
similares. No
and
tenemos
other
dentro
type
de
of
nuestro
similar
marco
initiatives.
contemplado
We
otros
do not
recursos
have,
de
however,
los
as part
mercados de
of our
carbono negro.
framework,
No es una
other
alternativa que
elements. For
nosotros
example,
estemos
black carbon.
planteando
This is not a
algo
substance that we
dentro
are considering to
del marco
include
regulatorio para el
as part
artículo
of
6,
the
pero
regulatory
pues digamos
framework
que
for
al
Article
tener
6.
Colombia una meta
But
que abarca todos
let's
los
say
niveles de
that
efecto
since Colombia
invernadero,
has
es decir,
a
nuestra meta
goal
de reducción de emisiones
that
no es solamente
includes
CO2,
all
sino
of
también
the
otros gases
greenhouse
de efecto
gas
invernadero, pues se podrían añadir un poco
emission
también
gas
gestiones e
elements,
iniciativas
we could
como
also
el metano.
start
De pronto, Amanda, si
finding a way
tienes
to
experiencias
include
a nivel
other
internacional, a mí se me
initiatives.
escapan porque no es
If Amanda, for
pero
example,
pues
has
nuestra
some
meta es poder
international things that
contar
she
con
can
la
share
experiencia de
with
nivel
us,
nacional.
that would be really interesting because that's as far as we go in terms of Colombia.
Gracias, Carolina.
Thank you,
¿Alguna pregunta
Carolina.
sobre estas iniciativas, Amanda?
Any idea that you would like to share, Amanda, in this regard?
I think with respect to black carbon, that is because it's not a gas and it behaves differently. Kind of, there has been a lot of work over the years to attempt to figure out how to quantify that kind of in relation to carbon markets, and that's still underway. We had a meeting this morning where we spoke a little bit of some work. The International Energy Agency has a carbon credit task force, and there's work on kind of clean cooking and clean energy funded by the Clean Air Fund to try to explore how do we kind of show the economic return associated with household energy specifically. So I think that is still a complex area, but one where people have been doing a lot of thinking to try to inform, because it is, as we talked earlier, kind of to drive finance, you need to show kind of the return, and that's much easier right now for greenhouse gases than it is for something like black carbon.
Gracias, Amanda. Totalmente de acuerdo. Creo que el que se empiezan a
Thank
discutir
you
este
very
tipo de
much, Amanda.
iniciativas
I
sí
totally
sí
agree
generan
that starting to
acuerdos
discuss this
y
type
muchos
of
temas
initiatives
de
will
los
make it
países.
so that
Siguiendo
climate
un poquito
action
con esto que ya
is much
mencionaba
more
Amanda,
comprehensive.
quisiera preguntarte
So,
cuáles son los
continuing with
mayores
that
desafíos
frame,
para
Amanda,
garantizar sistemas
this is a question for you. What are the
y
main
transparentar
challenges
el
to
seguimiento o el
guarantee
cumplimiento de las metas de reducción
systems, for
que se
example,
puedan establecer con los países
MRBA, and make it more transparent in terms of
contaminantes
the
climáticos de vida corta?
follow-up of how these reduction goals are actually happening in terms of SLCPs?
Estás en silencio.
Yeah, I missed just the end of that question. Could you repeat it?
Sí, seguro. Los
Sure,
mayores desafíos
sorry
para
for that.
garantizar sistemas
Yeah, what are the
de
main
planetariedad y
challenges to
cumplimiento de
guarantee
las
the
metas de reducción
MRB
de
systems to
contaminantes climáticos
guarantee
de vida
the
corta?
fulfillment of the goals that we have for SLCPs?
And certainly, monitoring in particular, as I mentioned, remains a challenge in a lot of places. And so it shouldn't be a barrier to action, but ultimately, kind of in order to demonstrate progress, there will need to be kind of monitoring that kind of people can have confidence in. And obviously making sure kind of the enforcement areas are very tricky often. But I think it's gathering the sufficient data to kind of verify that kind of what we've said we will do, we have done.
Gracias. Seguimos,
Thank
afortunadamente.
you very much for that answer. We have so many questions. I'm trying to group them by themes. And here we have a question and a comment for Abraham,
Específicamente, si hay alguna política
particularly
o
whether
considera la
there
importancia de
are
impulsar
policies or what
conectividades
would
para
be the
transporte terrestre
importance
y la
of
navegación y contribuir con
fostering
esto a la
sustainable
estabilización y
fuels
reducción
for land
de gases
transportation and
climáticos
aviation,
debido a
and the contribution of that to the decarbonization and the reduction of SLCPs.
Gracias, una pregunta interesante y debatible.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting question, quite debatable, right?
Yo creo
The
que
question is
en
whether
términos de
there will be
combustibles
sustainable
ya
fuel.
estamos
When we
en
talk
todos los
about
propios
fuel,
procesos de combustión,
we are
muchos
talking
son
about
fósiles en su gran
combustion,
mayoría,
and
como
many of them
decía,
are
esa es
fossil
una de las discusiones que se ha
in nature,
tenido
in
también
origin.
tanto a nivel
So that's
de
part of
las
the
COPs
discussion that
como
has
en el
been going
IPCC.
on
Yo creo
around
que el tema de los gases de
IPCC
transición
and COPs.
energéticos, de
I
transición
believe
energética,
that the
creo que es una
issue of transition
salida
gases
que sí, de
or
alguna manera todos
transition
pensamos que es en el
energy
corto
elements like
plazo una
methane,
salida inmediata. Yo creo que
it could
ya
be
tendríamos
a
que pensar en otro
short-term
tipo de alternativas.
alternative,
Creemos
but
que,
I think that
por
we should be
ejemplo, la
thinking
cadena
of other type of
energética
alternatives already,
asociada inclusive a
because I believe
renovables
that the
busca la
energy change
salida
related to renewable
a un
energies
proceso
is
de
the
cero emisiones.
door
Creo que esa es la
towards a
manera en que todo
zero
estaría bien de
emission
encontrar
path.
combustibles
I believe that that's the
en
way
ese
that I would
sentido.
like to think about
Si hablamos
fuels.
del hidrógeno
Um,
en
if
nuestra
we talk
óptica,
about
el tema de que la
hydrogen,
cadena de valor,
under this
qué
framework
tema
around
tendríamos desde la
the
parte
value
energética
chain,
que no estaríamos utilizando
what
algún
can
combustible,
we
¿no? O
say
sea,
from
algún
the
energético
energy
tradicional que
perspective that we are
permita
not
el
using
uso
an
propio del
additional
hidrógeno?
fuel that
Entonces,
is not
yo
allowing the
invitaría
use
a
of
que
hydrogen, for example?
todo el
So
análisis de los
I
combustibles
would
pase por la
invite
cadena de valor, que
for
dentro de
all
la
of the
cadena de
discussion
valor
around
no exista
fuels
algún
to
elemento que nos
be
oriente por ese
understood from the
propósito.
lens of the
Si esa es
value
la
chain
visión o la
and
salida,
to
creo que estamos
avoid
en el camino correcto
going back to
hacia
fossil at all costs.
un
And
sistema energético
I
donde
believe
más que un
that
tema de
if
combustibles,
we
sea un
want to
sistema
go
energético
towards a
más
correct
sostenible y más
path,
sustentable.
I would move away from fuels and I
Gracias,
would
Abraham.
move towards a more sustainable and
Vamos
energy efficient way.
avanzando. Hay una pregunta para Carolina
Thank you very much.
que nos
There's a
envió
question here for
Carolina.
Carolina.
En la presentación,
That
por parte,
is,
mencionaste
in
algunas
your
actividades para
presentation, you
reducir emisiones de
mentioned
gases
some
de efecto
activities
invernadero,
around
pero que
reducing
aumentan las emisiones de
greenhouse gas
carbono
emissions,
negro.
but that
Y nos
increase
pregunta
black
si
carbon
podrías
emissions.
profundizar un poquito
Can
en
you
ese tema.
provide more details around that?
Sí, justo en línea con lo que menciona Abraham sobre
Of
los
course.
combustibles de
So this is
transición,
aligned to what Abraham was
¿en qué
saying
momento
around
dejamos
transition
algún tipo de
fuels.
combustible o
At what
energético
point
para hacer
we
un paso
leave
a este
aside
combustible de
a
transición?
fuel
Tenemos que tener en cuenta.
in
De
order
igual
to
van a generar
move
emisiones de
towards the
carbono
transition
negro
fuel.
sobre
So
todo
we
en el
need to
sector
consider
residencial.
that in that
Entonces,
transition,
¿cómo allí vamos
some
a tener que
emissions of black
generar
carbon
este
will be
mecanismo para
generated, particularly in the
reducir
residential
esos
sector.
impactos de estos
So
cambios de
here we
carbono
will
negro
have to find
en
or create a
las familias,
mechanism
principalmente
to reduce
familias
the impact of
vulnerables?
these
¿Cómo
black
les
carbon
proponemos
emissions
a ellos una
in vulnerable
solución
families,
que no
particularly.
es un
How do we give them a
paso
solution which
único,
is a short-term
pero
step in a
seguimos
way,
teniendo algunos efectos
but
secundarios
still
en
with
términos
secondary
de salud? ¿O si
or side
definitivamente
effects
planteamos
around
una alternativa que nos
health
lleve a reducir
factors,
completamente esos
or
impactos
whether we
y esos efectos en
definitely
salud?
find an alternative that would
Medidas
allow us
más
to completely
eficientes,
reduce those
creo que
impacts.
tiene que
So there are
interpretarse
more
de dos
efficient
maneras.
ways.
Solamente
So we need to
no
interpret this in
estaríamos
two
reduciendo
ways.
el 100% las
We
emisiones
would
y esos
not be
impactos en
reducing
salud, pero
100% of the
también
emissions and
hay
the
una
health
evaluación.
impacts,
Vamos a tener
but
que realizar una
also
inversión y
there's
llevar
an assessment
a unos
around what
procesos
type of
de
investment will be
transformación de las
needed and
actividades,
what
porque
type
muchas
of
veces estos cambios implican
transformation
refiere sobre
process will
todo
be
a nivel
carried out, because
residencial.
many
Requieren un
cases
cambio en la forma de
this
hacer
type
las
of
cosas
technology
por
around
lo que esperamos también
residentials,
a futuro que
residential
puede
area
pasar de pronto
require
tengamos una tecnología mucho
a
más limpia.
shift
Entonces,
of how things are
estos
being done. until we have a cleaner energy. So these technologies of transition are actually more useful when we talk about a social environment, or whether we need to do the big leap towards cleaner energies and much more efficient. So this is part of the discussion around the
Gracias, Carolina.
results
Creo
that we
que
saw.
hay un tema por ahí
Thank you very much,
inicialmente
Carolina. That is a very
en
interesting
combustibles
topic
de
that is
estufas
reflected
termales de
in
leña, por ejemplo,
the
¿no?
initiatives
Probablemente
around,
son
for
naves
example,
sobrevivientes.
stoves
Muchísimas gracias.
that
Tengo
are
una
have a
pregunta
different
que tiene que
mechanism of
ver con
operation.
fermentación
Here's
entérica y
another
me
question
gustaría
around
preguntarles a cada uno de los panelistas
enteric
al respecto.
fermentation, and I'd like to ask each of
Pregunto
the
específicamente sobre las
panelists.
emisiones de metano
So,
la
particularly
fermentación
around
entérica
the
y
methane
pensaba cuando
emissions
estaban de
on
aviso con la
enteric
parte del hub de
fermentation.
agriculture
So,
que tiene
Amanda,
la
could you talk about
CCAC
the
y tal vez
agriculture
Abraham,
hub that
Carolina puedan
CCAC
comentar
has?
sobre lo que
And
México y
Carolina can
Colombia están
perhaps talk
haciendo para
about
atender
What
este
Mexico
problema.
and Colombia are doing
Si
to
quieres empezamos contigo, Amanda.
address this problem. So, Amanda, if you'd like to start.
Sure, and I'm certainly not an expert on agriculture, but CCAC has a what's called a hub, which is focused on the sector and is working with the industry to try to find solutions both for the methane emissions, but also the black carbon emissions. So looking not just at enteric fermentation, but kind of how we deal with crops and avoid open burning. It's and so that is focused on kind of trying to find solutions that are kind of amenable to the sector that farmers will buy into, and so we'll achieve real emission reductions.
Gracias, creo que es un muy buen recurso para consultar.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that.
Carolina,
Carolina,
¿alguna
would you
idea
like
de
to
fermentación
also
entérica?
Sí, en
provide your comments?
Colombia, bueno, el tema de
Sure.
fermentación
In
entérica,
Colombia, the
principalmente
enteric
los inventarios de
fermentation,
emisiones en
particularly
ganadería,
around
tienen acciones diferenciales en el
livestock
país a
emission
funcionar y hemos
inventories,
estado avanzando
they have
bastante en
differential
poder tener factores de
actions. And
emisiones
in the country, we
locales y
have been able
regionales,
to
porque es diferente
create
un poco
or
cómo
to
se maneja
have
la ganadería en los llanos
factors
orientales
for
a cómo se
local and
comporta,
regional
digamos, en la zona
emissions,
andina.
because it's different
Entonces,
how this
hemos venido
is
avanzando
measured
bastante en
and
poder
behaves.
entender cuáles son esos
So we
factores de
have made
emisiones
actually
específicos
quite good progress in
en
terms
una
of trying to
zona
understand
o en
the
una región y
a
es un esfuerzo
effects
que
of
lleva
these
bastantes años
specific emission factors
desarrollándose no solamente
in
por
certain
equipos privados,
regions.
sino también
This is
por
something that has been worked on
ONGs
by
y
private
internacionales
groups, but
gobiernos. Es uno de los
also
elementos
by
en los que
NGOs.
hemos avanzado y queremos seguir
This is one
avanzando
of the elements that we've
una
seen
gran
progress,
batalla
and
y es como en un
however, we
país
do
en
have a
el
barrier
que
here,
la
which
ganadería
is
es
how do
principalmente
we make it
extensiva,
so that in a
implementamos
country
acciones de
where
mitigación eficientes para poder reducir
livestock
estas emisiones de metano que
and
sean costo
agriculture
efectivas y
is
que no
so extensive,
incidan
how do we implement
en la
action of
economía
mitigation
o
that are
generen
actually efficient,
realmente un
but
beneficio
that
neto
also
para
don't
las
have
economías
a
locales y las
negative
pequeñas
net
economías?
impact on the
Entonces,
local and small
hay
economies of the
allí un gran
country?
balance, ¿no?
So that's a
Tenemos unos
big
grandes
balance that
emisores,
we
por
need to
ejemplo,
strike. We
digamos,
have these
instituciones mucho más
big
organizadas y cómo
emission
los traemos a la conversación, pero
sectors,
también desde
and
un
how do we
punto de
bring them to the
eficiencia
conversation
ambiental y eficiencia en las
from a
emisiones,
point of view
como
of
esta conversación que
environmental
se ha abierto
efficiency and
sobre
emission
rasgos de
efficiency,
intensidad, pero podemos denominarlo
particularly
como
around
intensidad en los procesos de
the issue
producción
of
y
carbon
también
intensity
cómo en un
or
balance
even
no afectamos a las
methane
pequeñas
intensity.
comunidades y a los
But at the
pequeños
same time,
productores
as I
que
was saying, how do we
dependen
not
también de
negatively
este mismo
impact the
tipo de
small communities that
actividades.
depend on this type of activity?
Gracias, Carolina. Abraham,
Thank
¿alguna
you,
pregunta
Carolina.
sobre
Abraham,
fermentación
any
entérica?
comment there?
Bueno, yo creo que ya lo mencionó Amanda y lo mencionó Carolina. Yo no quiero también
Yeah, I
repetir lo que
think
estamos
Amanda and Carolina
comentando. Aquí
mentioned
nada más lo importante es
what needs to
mantener
be
la
said
calidad
around that.
alimentaria
But what
en
I
la
would
región,
like
en
to
el
add
sector de los países.
is to
México, en el tema del
maintain
metano, en el
food
tema de
safety in
fermentación, la
our
parte
countries.
ganadera en realidad es un
In
tema
Mexico,
de gran
the
emisión de metano.
livestock
Entonces, lo que
industry,
estamos
it's a
haciendo
big
justamente
methane
a través de la
emission
coalición, tuvimos un
factor.
acercamiento con
So, as part
el
of the
gobierno del
coalition,
área de
we
agricultura, el
had an
Ministerio de Agricultura de
approach
Brasil, para
with
hacer un
the
convenio de
Ministry of
colaboración
Agriculture from Brazil
con
so that we
Brasil, con el
can
objetivo de
work
compartir
on a
experiencias
collaboration agreement
que Brasil ha
around Mexico and
principalmente
Brazil so that we can
enfocado
share
mucho en la parte
experiences.
ganadera,
Brazil has a very
en
big
términos de una
agricultural
mayor
industry.
productividad y una menor
And
emisión. Eso
so
es
the discussion
importantísimo
would be around
tratar
less
de llevar
emissions
este
and more
equilibrio, como ya lo mencionó
productivity.
Carolina,
the balance that Carolina mentioned that needs to be struck is obviously very, very important. We need to understand this from the regional perspective, that we have small, medium, and big producers, and there we address economies at these three levels in such a way that they can have part of a sustainable production model with low emissions. If we are able to strike that balance, we can align to the goals. What would be a contradiction is to not reach a proposal and maintain emissions. Obviously, that is connected to the MRB around the proposal related to satellite analysis. As Amanda was saying, certain of those things can be difficult to measure, but if we see, let's say, at a satellite level, how the production of emissions is increasing in the agricultural sector, is part of the goals that we want to help reduce. So I think that the balance that Carolina mentioned that needs to be struck is absolutely a priority on Mexico.
Muchas gracias, Abraham, Carolina, Amanda, por todos los
Thank you
comentarios y
very much, Abraham,
respuestas.
Carolina, and Amanda, for all of your
Algunos que por ahí
answers to
faltan
these
dentro del
questions. We
chat,
have some
pueden entrar al
questions in the
chat y
chat
los
or in the
vamos a revisar.
Q&A still
Pero
there.
quiero
I
dejar
invite you
de
to
mencionar
take a look at them
algunos
if you can.
comentarios más
But I'd
que se
like to
encuentran
just provide
en
some
el chat.
comments
Por ejemplo,
that we received in the
platicaban
chat.
de
So we
un estudio en
received a
donde 4,5 millones de
comment
veteranos
where there
encontraron
were
como
4.5
enfermedades vinculadas con partículas PM2.5
million
y por ahí nos dejaban el link
specimens
de
were
esta
found
publicación.
with
Está
illnesses
otro
related to PM
comentario en
2.5
donde se
particles.
hablaba
There's
del
that comment there that
famoso
I invite you
Dieselgate,
to read.
cuando se trataba
There was
del
also a
diésel y
comment
que no
around
hacía
the
conformidad
so-called
con los
Dieselgate
con los estándares
that
internacionales.
not
Nos
necessarily
comentan
met the
también
international standards.
algo en
That's an interesting
relación
comment. There was another comment about something related
los
to
como seguimiento en términos de los mercados de carbono voluntarios.
following
Nos
up
invitan a
on
revisar el Global Heat
voluntary
Reduction
carbon
Initiative,
market.
en
The
donde
Global
hay
Heat Reduction Initiative
temas específicos
is
al
a
respecto.
resource that
Y
they are
bueno,
inviting
hay
us
algunos más,
to
pero
check out.
invito a los
Thank you
que
so
lo
much for
gusten,
these
pueden
comments.
publicarlas por acá. Quedaron unas cuantas, la verdad no son muchas.
There are a few
Y
comments
por
that I'd like to invite
en
panelists
aras de
to
mantener
respond
el tiempo,
perhaps
quisiera
directly in the
pasar
chat.
nuevamente
So just to
el
keep on
micrófono
with
a
our
Beatriz.
agenda, I
Quiero
will now
simplemente
pass the floor
agradecerles a
to
todos, a toda nuestra
Beatriz once
audiencia,
again,
su
not
participación y
without
las preguntas
thanking
que nos
and
hicieron
showing
llegar
appreciation
vía
for
el chat. Por
our
supuesto,
audience.
Carolina,
And thank you
Amanda,
for your
Abraham,
questions and
por su
comments
participación
that
y
were
su
addressed
visión
to
para
Amanda,
atenderlas.
Carolina, and Abraham. And
Y
thank
bueno,
you very
sin
much to our
más,
panelists for your
organizo
answers.
el micrófono
Um,
para la
Without
siguiente
further
sesión.
ado, I will now pass the floor to Beatriz.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, creo que ha sido una
Thank
charla,
you very
un
much. I believe
intercambio
that this has been
de
a very
experiencias
interesting
y de
experience
conocimientos
exchange and knowledge
recientes.
exchange
Esto
today in
solo
this
puede ser el
webinar.
inicio. Teníamos
This
como
can
objetivo
only be the
conocer,
beginning, right?
intercambiar lo que se
The
está
purpose of
haciendo
this
igual
webinar
en
is
los
to
países
know,
y
to
también
learn,
llamar la
and to
atención
exchange
de
experiences
esta
of what's
coyuntura
happening
de
in
que
our
se toman
countries,
dos
and also
semanas
to
en donde
understand, to take advantage of
miembros
what
de la
has happened
comunidad
in
de
recent weeks,
salud, de clima y
where
aire
members of their community
se
of
reunieron
the
para
public
pues
sector, health
identificar
public
algunas
sector,
formas de
and
empezar a avanzar
air quality
muchísimo más
got together
rápido
to identify
y
ways
reducir los
around
impactos
working
en la
faster
salud
and
en
more
los ecosistemas
efficiently
y al mismo tiempo
around
lograr
reducing
esta reducción
health
de las
impacts, but
emisiones
at
de
the same time
contaminantes
reducing
climáticos de vida corta,
um,
así como gases de efecto
pollutant,
invernadero. Creo que el
short-lived
día de
climate
hoy
pollutants,
vivimos algo que
and
no se
how they are
veía
included in
y
our
nos topamos esa
NDCs.
necesidad de
Something that came
trabajar
up
de
today
manera
is
transdisciplinaria,
that
trabajar y
there's a
trabajar
need
en
to
silos
work
cuando muchas veces podríamos
together.
hacerlo. Quienes han trabajado y han
We should
trabajado en aire no
avoid
necesariamente necesitan
working in silos. Many of us that have been here
colaboración
for a
con
long
clima y con
time
salud, a
have
veces
not
sí.
necessarily
Creo que
found
es una
a
oportunidad
connection
magnífica de
with
que
our colleagues in
desde
climate or health.
estadounidenses
So
incorporemos
this is a
estos temas
great
en nuestra agenda
opportunity
y que nos
based
interesen
on
y
the
que nos permitirían ser no solamente
NDCs
más eficientes y
that
más
we can
eficaces en
incorporate these
alcanzar estos
topics in
objetivos.
order to be much more
También hablamos de
efficient
muchos
in
otros
achieving
países y
our
tanto
milestones
Colombia como México
and
tienen
goals.
un trabajo
Likewise, we
pionero,
discussed
pero
today
también en
the
donde la
pioneer work
experiencia de
that
México
Colombia and
trabajar
Mexico
con
have
calidad del
done, but
aire
also
ha permitido también
how
avanzar
their experiences in air
en la
quality has
identificación de
allowed them
acciones
to
como también en la
identify
demostrar los
action
beneficios que se tienen
and define
tanto en reducir
showing the
contaminantes,
benefits in public health when air pollutants are reduced. Abraham mentioned the case of ozone, and how other benefits as well can be achieved by the reduction of LCSPs, for example. And that is another comment from our participants. I believe Romina commented that. What are the experiences that have happened in the northern and southern hemisphere? And Amanda said something really interesting. How can we learn from the things that didn't work in other places? That's a very important lesson that we take away today. The acknowledgement of the work in Mexico and Colombia can help us a lot to take steps forward. We already mentioned that even though one of the platforms that is focused right now in air quality can allow for collaboration and the identification of health impacts and climate impacts around incorporating SLCPs in NDCs and also understanding the effects in public health. I would like to also mention the great opportunity that exists currently in the private sector that has done great efforts in reducing emissions, but now this is a good opportunity as well to approach them and for them to understand what are the commitments that they can also take to join the NDCs. We know that there's a lot of work to do in our sectors, a lot of opportunities as well. Definitely the issue of transport, the issue of enteric fermentation, the issue of cooking, clean cooking, and also we discussed today the importance of tools that exist out there with the use of data. So the new tools that use, for example, satellites offer a great opportunity to understand better what we can do. These tools can allow us to really identify where the benefits are in implementing action in health and ecosystems. And of course, always to show what are the benefits for the health of populations and particularly populations that are in a vulnerable situation. We also talked about the big challenges that we see, notwithstanding the big progress that Colombia and Mexico has seen. So the more we talk about it, the more we present the benefits around the implementation and the actions that we have taken around costs that have been saved and also public health and the protection of ecosystems, that can be a great opportunity for us all. I think that we are in a very critical moment in our countries. Countries are reviewing their NDCs, and this is a great opportunity to include issues around health, pollutants, and to bring the conversation of LCSPs to our NDCs. Thank you so much to our team in WRI that has been working behind the scenes to make this possible today and in previous weeks. Thank you very much, Ceci, Patty, Raul, and the whole team. Thank you very much to our panelists for being so generous with your time and with sharing your knowledge and your vision. Thank you so much for being here.